Hey everyone. This is a lesson on wrapping functions. It's something I needed to do in one of my code bases recently and I thought it would make a cool lesson, so let's go ahead and dive in. So in this repository here, we have three files that we're going to use primarily. We have the index.js, which is going to be where we're going to be writing our code. And then we have the test.js, which is going to be testing our code. And we have a reporter.js, which we use later, and I'll explain what this is doing exactly for the test cases. So to start with, we have three functions: first, second, and third. And these functions, each one of them under certain conditions, will throw an error. These conditions are kind of arbitrary. They're just for the sake of the example. So for the first one, you can see that if x is less than 0, we're just going to go ahead and throw an error. Right now, the way the test cases are set up, when we go ahead and run them, we're going to see that all three of these errors are going to be thrown. So this first test case right here, we can see we're passing in -2 to the first function, which is going to go ahead and throw an error. Inside of the second function, we're passing 4 and 4, which is the conditions for throwing an error inside of the second function. If x is equal to y, then we're throwing the function here. And same thing for the third. We're going to set off that error. So if we run the test cases now, I'm using Mocha for the test cases inside of this repository. So if I run Mocha, we'll see that all three errors are getting set off, right? We can see that they're being logged to the console. So we can see x cannot be less than 0, x cannot equal y, x and y must be greater than z. Cool. Okay, so the first thing that we want to do is we want to try and capture these errors. So for the first one, let's focus on this first function first. So we're going to go ahead and try and capture the error just by doing a simple try catch. So I'll put this entire function body inside of this try catch. And if there's an error, if the conditions arise such that an error is thrown, we're going to go ahead and report it. So, well, first let's just try and run this before we report it. So if we run this right now, we see that that first test case is no longer showing an error, but we're still not passing the test case, right? There's an assertion error. So if we go into our test cases, we see that the first function is thrown with a -2 number in here. So it's throwing an error because x cannot be less than 0. But we have an assertion down here that reporters.errors.length should be 1. So what's happening here? In this repository, we have a function, or we have a file called reporter, and this reporter is taking the place of something that you might have in a production environment, where if you have functions that are throwing errors, you might want to capture those errors and then log them so that later you can go look them up and say, oh, what kind of errors are my users running into, and fix them, right? So in these cases, we might not want these errors to throw all the way to the top of the application, which might stop the application, and unless you have like a fatal error that you can't recover from. But in these cases, we're thinking of errors that maybe don't stop the application entirely. Maybe we can render an error to our user to let them know that functionality is not available, and hopefully it doesn't interrupt their service too much, right? So for these functions, we're trying to capture the errors and log them to our reporter. That's the goal of this exercise. So in here, we see that reporter.errors.length should be 1. So when we capture this error inside of our try catch, we're going to take the reporter and we're going to go ahead and say reporter.captureError, and we're going to go ahead and pass that error through. And if we do that, it's going to go ahead and push that error onto our errors array. So the length is then going to be equal to 1. You can see that we also have this initialize function, which is just resetting the errors. This .length is equal to 0 is setting the array to an empty array at the beginning of each of these test cases. So you can see that before we run these test cases, we're initializing the reporter just for the sake of making sure that our test cases work, right? So when we run this first function, we're expecting 1 error to be inside of our errors array. Now that we've added that, we can see that the first test case is passing because we are capturing this error and reporting it to our reporter, right? Okay, so this video is all about wrapping functions. We could take this try catch and put it into our second and third functions and also pass those test cases. However, what we really want to do here is we want to create some function that has reusable functionality that we could use across all these three functions instead of having to write the try catch in each one. So what I'm going to create is a function called wrap. And this function is going to take a function as an argument and return a new function. So we take this function and we're going to return a new function. Okay, so before we move on in a wrap function, how we're going to use this is important, right? So we take this function wrap and we're going to use it to wrap our first function when we export it, right? So what the test cases are now going to get in this first function that they're importing is this new wrapped function, right? So instead of getting that first function, the test cases are going to get this new wrap function, which should behave similarly to this first function, except that it's going to report exceptions to our reporter. So if it behaves similarly to this first function, the first thing we're going to want to do is we're going to want to take that x variable as an argument. See? So we have this function that takes x as an argument, and we're going to go ahead and do the same thing down here in our new wrap function that we're returning from wrap. So x is coming in as an argument, and now what we're going to do is we're going to try and take this try catch and we're going to put it inside of our wrap function instead. So we have try catch error, and if there's an error, we'll report that error to our reporter, so we can rip this all out of our first function. Now our first function is pretty clean, right? It'll throw an error if x is less than 0, and our wrap function is going to be where we handle the reporting and the capturing of the errors. Except the one thing we haven't done here yet is we need to actually call the function, right? So how do we call the function? Remember, again, so this wrap function is taken first as an argument, which is this function here. So we're going to want to take this function and pass that argument x into it, right? This is that argument that's being passed from the test cases, -2, and going into this wrap function, which is then being passed to this first function, which we passed into wrap. So if we go ahead and do that, now this should accomplish the same thing that we did before with the try catch inside of that first function, except having done it inside of the wrap function. So let's go see if the test cases work now. Great, look at that. We're passing. Okay, so we passed the first test case. So now the goal is to apply this same logic to our second function. So I'm going to move this wrap function down now, just so we can keep it in our view, right, now that we're working on the second function. So for this second function, we could just go for broke, and we could say, hey, maybe it'll work on the second function. Let's go ahead and wrap the second function and see if it passes the test cases. Okay, it didn't, but it also didn't throw an error, right? We could see that the third one threw an error, but the second one here is only getting that assertion error again. The reporter did not see the error. Now, why? So if we look into the test cases here, this second function is being passed the variables 4 and 4, which should not be equal according to the conditions here. X should not equal Y, right? If it does, we're going to throw an error. So these variables, if they are passed in correctly, should raise an error. But when we look at the wrap function that's being passed in here, we can see that only one argument is being passed in. So only this first 4 is being passed to our wrap function, which is then being called this second function. So x is equal to 4, y is going to be equal to undefined, and of course 4 is not equal to undefined, so this error is not getting thrown. What we want to actually do is make sure that we pass all the arguments through to the function as we would expect. So what we could do here is we could take X and we could take Y and go ahead and pass them through to our wrap function. And now we expect our test cases to pass. So we did. We passed the first test case and we passed the second test case. Now we just need to pass the third. So we could take this wrap function, bring it down here, and think about the third function. Now we might be thinking, let's just add a third variable, z, right? And pass it into the function here. This will work, and we can take wrap, and we can wrap our third function, and export that, run the test cases, and see that everything is passing. Great. However, when we think about it, what's happening here is kind of, it's not a general pattern, right? What if we wanted to do 4 variables? Of course, the variables that we named here are pretty poorly named, because once we get to 4, what are we going to do? Wrap around the alphabet? We're going to go X, Y, Z, A, B, C, and then we need to pass them through to the function. It's starting to get a little silly, starting to get a little messy, right? What we can do instead is we can get a little more general with it, right? We can take in only the arguments that were being passed and then pass those to the wrap function. We can do this with the with the rest parameters syntax inside of the wrap function, and then we could take the spread operator and spread these arguments to this new function, right, inside of here, or to the wrapped function inside of our new function. And once we do that, then we expect these test cases still to work. And now we're only passing through the arguments that we need to pass through, right? So if we were to console.log args.length, in each of these, we could see that we're only passing through 1 argument in the first one, 2 in the second, and 3 in the third. Perfect. Okay, so now this is starting to look like a general reusable function. Great. That's exactly what we were here for, right? So we wrote a general reusable function, wrap, which is reporting an error if it happens, and it doesn't blow up the entire application, right? The error doesn't bubble up to the top. Instead, we're just reporting it to a reporter where hopefully we can log the errors and look at them later so we can fix them. Great. Okay. So last thing to do here now is maybe clean up how we're exporting this, right? If this wrapper function ever changed its name to say like, wrap safe, right? Because now we're kind of making these a little bit more safe. We'll need to change the name of this wrap function in 3 different places. We could kind of clean this up a little bit by just taking these off here. And since we're exporting an array already, we can just sort of iterate over each of these functions and wrap them in turn. So there's a great function for that. It's called map. And with the map, we can wrap. So we're mapping the wrap function over the first, second, and third functions, which is going to return a new function for each, which is then going to, I think I lost a a brace in there, a curly brace. So the first, second, and third there, we're wrapping each one of them in turn and then returning that new wrap function. This is the same as doing something like this, where we take the function and then passing it to the wrap, and both will work. So if we save this and we run it, we could see that that works. And we could also take this shortened syntax where we're simply passing the wrap function to each of the map functions and returning the new wrapped function. That should work as well. Great. Okay. Well, that's a wrap function. Hope you guys enjoyed that video. I'll put a link to the GitHub repository down below where you can download and clone this exact environment so you can run it on your own and learn a little bit more about wrapping functions. Hope you guys enjoyed that, and that's a wrap.